Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Back in 2013, Sigma released their 18 to 35 millimeter f1.8 zoom for APS-C cameras. That lens became a kind of a cult classic, particularly amongst those that shot video, and I've seen it adapted to a wide variety of different platforms when mirrorless cameras began to come out, for the simple reason that it was a zoom lens with a constant maximum aperture of f1.8. Now, as soon as Sigma started to reveal the details about their newest lens to me, I was immediately reminded of that lens because in many ways, the lens I'm reviewing today, which is the Sigma 28 to 45 millimeter f1.8 DGDN Art Series lens, is the world's first f1.8 full frame zoom lens. It's not just a shoddy attempt at this. This is a remarkable performer, as you're going to see in today's review. Now, obviously, it's not small and it's not cheap at $1,350 US, but this is a lot of lens for the money. So is it worth considering? Well, we're going to explore that together right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So some of the standout features of this lens include the fact that it is the world's first f1.8 full-frame zoom. Sigma touts the fact that it has prime-like optical performance, which is certainly the case. In fact, in their own internal literature, they actually favorably compare this lens to their 24 and 50 millimeter f1.4 Art Series prime lenses. So that tells you optically it is very good. It has a full range of features, including some video-specific features, as we'll explore in just a moment. There's multiple custom buttons here. There is an aperture ring with iris declick and iris lock. There is also, this is an internally zooming lens, and because of that and the fact that it has thorough weather sealing, this is a very quality lens when it comes to the weather sealing because of the fact that it's internally focusing, internally zooming, and it has all of the gaskets and seals inside. Now, as noted, this is a large lens. The diameter is 87.8 millimeters or 3.5 inches, which by the way is the exact same as the recent 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 Art Series zoom. But this lens is longer than that lens. It's 153.4 millimeters or a full 6 inches in length. 82 millimeter filter threads up front. Now, part of the reason why this lens is so long is the fact that it is an internally zooming lens. Those tend to be longer because all of what would be happening outside of the lens in terms of external focus or zooming happens inside the lens barrel itself. So you do pay a price of having a larger lens, but the trade-off for that has always been the fact that there are some real advantages. When you have an internally zooming lens, for one thing, the zoom action, as it is here, tends to be smoother, better damped. There is nothing that is coming in and out, and so that means that there is less opportunities for particularly dust to get sucked into the interior of the lens. It means that if you're using the lens on a gimbal or some kind of system where you need to balance it, it means that it doesn't matter where you are at in the zoom range, the balance is going to be the same with the lens. There's just a lot of positives there. And certainly, while I don't always love carrying internally zooming lenses out to the field, once I have them there, I love them because the zoom action is really quick and light. It gives you a lot of control. And the fact that you're dealing with a constant length does make it a little bit easier to use in a variety of situations. As noted, this lens does have an aperture ring, which has become standard for Sigma's Art Series or Sport zoom lenses. And so this is the fully featured aperture here. There's 1/3 stop clicks or detents along the way. You can switch it into automatic mode if you don't want to use the clicks. But then there's also an option down here on the side where you can declick that aperture and then you can smoothly rack through the various aperture options there. There's also what's called an iris lock. So when you have that engaged, if you're engaging it while you're in the actual aperture ring portion, it means that you're going to be able to go throughout that aperture range, and in particular do aperture racking without worrying about going past the f16 point and into the automatic mode, which obviously would ruin your shot. But there's also the option there that if you're a person that says, you know what, I don't like an aperture ring, I prefer to control that from within the camera, no problem, put it into the automatic mode here, A here on the dial, and then engage that aperture lock, and then you don't have to worry about inadvertently bumping it into the manual aperture range. And so it really does give you a great deal of control there. We have an AF/MF switch here on the side, and then we have two custom function buttons. Now these are redundant, and so they're located to where you have one on the left side for your typical horizontal shooting, but then if you're shooting in vertical position, there's one at the top that allows you to access it there. Inside we have 11 aperture blades, rounded blades, and so it does give you a more circular aperture shape with that higher blade count than the older standard of 9 blades, and it gives you an interesting 22-pointed sun star when you stop it down. Minimum focus distance here is constant throughout the zoom range. It is 30 centimeters, and you can achieve a maximum magnification at the 45 millimeter end of 0.25 times. That's a 1:4 magnification ratio, which is high enough to be very useful. Combine that with a fast maximum aperture on this zoom, and you're able to get nicely blurred out backgrounds. And of course, as we're going to see in a moment, the bokeh quality is one of the really great aspects here. Sigma always includes a lens hood and then also a lens case with their better zoom lenses, and so both of those things obviously are welcome. So as you can see, this is a professional grade zoom. It has all the features you would expect on a top tier G Master lens or equivalent. So yeah, it is big and heavy. It does weigh in at 950 grams, right under a kilogram, making it quite heavy. But at the same time, I would point out that Canon's 28 to 70 millimeter f2 zoom, which is another unique zoom like this, it weighs in at 1,450 grams, so an extra 500 grams. And of course, the Sigma is $1,350. That Canon lens is $3,000. So obviously a value on that front as well. All told, this is a pretty nice package if you're willing to set aside the size and the weight. So let's talk autofocus here. The new standard for Sigma's better lenses has been their HLA focus motor. HLA stands for high-speed linear actuator. This is a high-thrust, high-powered focus motor that is basically silent in all the applications I've seen thus far. Actually, when I put the lens up next to my ear and I focused, I actually had to pull the camera away and check to make sure that it was actually focusing. That's how quiet it actually was. As you can see here from my indoor and outdoor focus tests, focus changes are basically instantaneous. There is no lag, no hesitation. You're going to get very, very fast autofocus out of this. This 45 millimeters is not super long, obviously, for shooting something like sports, but I did take it along to a softball game, and as you would expect, I had zero issues in focusing in that kind of setting. I also saw really excellent focus consistency in all of the various focus environments that I did, from, some events, shooting out in nature, all the different things that I typically do. I had very, very great autofocus accuracy, no issue with that. Now, I do always have to point out that when you're talking about third-party lenses on Sony, which I'm reviewing here, right now this lens comes to Sony E mount and then also to L mount. Here's hoping that it comes to Z mount in the future, because what I'm about to say is not true on Nikon. But Sony imposes a 15 frame per second limitation for all third-party non-Sony lenses. So part of the time I've used this lens on my Alpha 1, which has a maximum burst rate of 30 frames per second, but I'm capped off there at 15 frames per second using this lens. Now, to be fair, 15 frames per second is still a lot. So maybe not a major limitation for you, but obviously something you always have to consider if sports or action photography is part of what you would like to do with a lens like this. Now, on the video side of things, I found what I would call a little bit of a mixed bag. Now, when it comes to the focus pull side of things, you can see that focus pulls are very fast, very confident, no pulsing, no settling. There is some focus breathing there, but it's not overly pronounced. I also found that when I was testing for focus to see if it was parfocal. The lens isn't perfectly parfocal, but it's close enough that I think you can probably pull it off. And you can see here, zooming in and out, that it's not perfectly in focus. I had focused at 28 millimeters, so at 45 millimeters, wasn't perfectly in focus, but not bad, really. Where I found a little bit of the limitations is when I did my hand test, for example, the lens tended to stay a little bit stickier than what I would like. Obviously, I'm trying to get it to go from one thing to another. And sometimes even when the camera was fully blocked with my hand, it didn't shift focus to my hand. And so I didn't love that. But more importantly, I think for practical situations, is that I found that focus was kind of held onto in some situations during focus transitions and just real world video clips. And then when it actually did make the focus, it had a lot of thrust, so it focused really fast, but that feels a little bit abrupt. Now I could slow down focus a bit in camera, but it doesn't completely replace a kind of a detuning of that focus speed for a little bit more of a cinematic feel. And I do think that maybe Sigma should have gone for that. I've been actually filming a number of my recent YouTube episodes with this lens, just kind of testing how it works in a static environment like that, and I got flawless results. I never had any kind of moving around or hunting at all, but it locked onto my eye, stayed perfectly focused on that. So high marks in that regard. Overall, I would say this is a great autofocus performance. I just think that there's almost too much speed and thrust when it comes to the video side of things. So finally, I'm going to give you an optical breakdown here. There's an optical deep dive that will come at the end of the video if you would prefer that, but I'll give you kind of an overview here. We have 18 elements in 15 groups. 5 of those are SLD elements. 3 of them are aspherical elements. Sigma, as I noted, actually in their internal literature compares this lens favorably to their 24 and 50 millimeter f1.4 primes. Now, technically, this lens covers neither of those focal lengths, but what it does do is it's able to actually outperform them when you aggregate across the frame. It's able to outperform both of those lenses, which is pretty impressive since those are recent, high-end designs that came from Sigma themselves. This is a lens that is extremely, extremely sharp. And beyond that, it has a little bit of that special sauce that I only occasionally see from Sigma, and more on that in just a moment. Now, when it comes to the technical side of things, I saw basically no longitudinal chromatic aberration. I also saw no lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame. So fringing is very, very well controlled with this lens. I also found that this is a much better lens when it comes to the distortion side of things than the recent 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 Mark II zoom lens that I tested from Sigma. On the wide end, which of course isn't quite as wide, but on the wide end, there is a little bit of barrel distortion. I needed a +8 to correct, but it was very linear and I could very naturally correct it even without using the correction profile. There was a +45 of vignette in the corners, which is really not bad for an f1.8 zoom on the wide end. That's about a stop and a half or so, so not bad at all. On the telephoto end, the distortion pattern inverts to a pincushion style distortion, just a hair more. There's a -9 to correct, but very linear, no real issue there. A little bit more vignette. I needed a +60 to correct on the telephoto end, but again, that's about 2 stops, really not all that bad. When it comes to the sharpness and the contrast, this lens is amazingly good throughout the zoom range in the middle and the mid frame. It's as sharp as probably you could ever want at f1.8 and from there on. The corners, as the MTF suggests, are not as sharp. And so I found that the corners sharpened up at 28 millimeters. They sharpened up by about f4, giving you really great detail all across the frame, even on a 61 megapixel camera that I tested it on. There is some diffraction that starts to set in by f11 and a little bit more by f16, but this lens is so sharp that I actually found that it still looked pretty good, even with the effects of diffraction going even on my A7R5 and its 61 megapixels. 35 millimeters is the next mark place on the zoom range, and the lens is probably at its peak at 35 millimeters, just exquisitely sharp all across the frame, even at f1.8. 35 millimeters is just fantastic. And moving on to 40 millimeters, there's a mild regression from 35 millimeters, but the lens is still really, really sharp. And then at 45 millimeters, it ticks up a little bit, and I would say that it is second only to the 35 millimeter position in sharpness and contrast at 45 millimeters. And there it is actually really consistent all across the frame. Even the corners are sharp, even at f1.8. Beyond sharpness, however, I found that this lens had really beautiful bokeh and just overall rendering from the lens. There was something about the images that I just really liked. And there's been about 3 or 4 occasions where out of the dozens of Sigma lenses that I've reviewed, I'm surprised by just how extra special it is. It's like all of a sudden I find a Zeiss lens that's got Sigma branding on it. And this is one of those lenses. The bokeh is just really, really nice. And it's in a variety of situations, whether it's just ordinary shots like this one of just a gift on a table, people shots, nature shots. It just really looks fantastic. I also found that the flare resistance was good from the lens. It handled also the, when there's the sun right out of the frame, just a really strong performance there. And I would say that this is definitely one of Sigma's optical standouts. And that was true whether I was shooting stills or I was shooting video. In conclusion, this is, I believe, one of Sigma's best zooms ever at this point. And if you're looking at it technically from a comparison to the 18 to 35 millimeter lens, this is a much better lens than what that lens was in terms of the feature set, the autofocus system, and then the optical performance. That lens was well loved for a lot of reasons, but this is a better lens, period. It is feature rich, it is well made, it has great autofocus, it has incredible optics. It is a world's first lens that is actually really, really well executed. Now, obviously it's not a huge zoom range. It is big and heavy, but this is a lens that I think if you can put up with the size and the weight and can afford the price tag of $1,350 US, it's a lens that I think you will probably really, really love using. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my text review that is linked in the description down below. There's an image gallery and buying links there as well. Or stay tuned with me right now as we dive more deeply into the optical performance.
So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. Here at 28 millimeters, you can see that there is barrel distortion, but it is mild and also it is linear. Here's a manual correction using a +8, and you can see that everything is really nice and straight, so no issues there. +45 to correct for the vignette. So again, for a full frame zoom with an f1.8 aperture, that's not bad at all. As you move throughout the zoom range, you start to invert to a pincushion style distortion. You can see once again here, it is a little bit more pronounced than the barrel distortion, but just very mildly so. I needed a -9 to correct for it. And again, you can see very linear, very clean correction. There's a +60 to correct for the vignette in the corner. So a little bit heavier, but about 2 stops. Again, not bad at all. Longitudinal chromatic aberrations are very well controlled. You can see how neutral everything is before and after the plane of focus. That carries out into real-world situations where you can see that even in this high contrast area, there is just no fringing to see as we move towards defocus. Also in this shot with a lot of specular highlights, you can see if we zoom into where that's the highest contrast areas where the sun's coming around the blades of grass, and you can see there's just no fringing to see there. So there is a little bit of the lemon shape, to the specular highlights towards the edge of the frame, but you stop down a bit and that will go away, so no big issue there. Likewise, lateral chromatic aberrations are very well controlled. If you look at all of the transition areas from black to white here along the edge, you can just see it is very, very clean, no fringing to see there. So this tells us that we're probably in for a really strong optical performance when it comes to sharpness and contrast. Now again, this is 200% magnification that I'll show you the results at, and it's testing on a 61 megapixel Sony a7R5. So you can see in the center of the frame here at 200% that contrast and detail look fantastic. Likewise, in the mid frame looks really excellent. As we pan on down, contrast and detail looks good. It looks good also on both sides of the frame. Looks excellent here. Looks excellent over here as well. So we can see good centering thus far. We can see that it's a little bit softer as you get towards the edge. Not bad, I mean, still quite good. This side, you can see the same thing as we get towards that extreme corner. It is softening towards the very edge, but again, it's a consistent level. It doesn't look bad, and we get a consistent performance across the four corners. Now, if we do the very mild stop down to F2, we can see that there is ever so slightly more contrast there in the center of the frame. In the mid frame, it does look higher contrast there, and I would say that's the biggest gain. Down in the corner, I don't really see much happening there, and so the impact is greater in the mid frame, really above all else. We can see that from F2 to F2.8, there's only a mild improvement in the corners, but a slightly more significant one at F4. And if I switch over here, where we're not quite as deep down into the corner, you can see that it looks really excellent. Pop up here and you can see it starting to look quite good. It's really only off in this upper last degree that there's any softness remaining, but overall we're looking really sharp across the frame here at F4. So that excellent sharpness continues through F11, where there's a little bit of softening due to diffraction, but you can see that F11 still looks pretty fantastic, so I'm not too concerned about that. F16 is softer, but not so soft that it's unusable. So this lens is so sharp that even diffraction can't quite keep it down. Now, as I noted earlier, there's actually a pretty marked improvement at 35 millimeters, even though the bar was already pretty high. You can see that 35 millimeters is really considerably sharper, and we can see that you can see that at different points in the frame. This basically looks like the stop-down version of 28 millimeters, even at f1.8. I really found it stood out in this zone here. You can just see, if you compare the two, how much finer the detail and the contrast is in this zone. Looks really excellent. We can take a look over here. Just see how all of those little dots of the pigment that go into making up the bill, how much they just pop off the page compared to the 28 millimeter metric. And so it's a really, really strong improvement. At 35 millimeters, you stop down to f2.8 and you're getting into pretty epic levels of sharpness and contrast. It looks really, really amazing. Now at 40 millimeters, there's a very, very mild regression when it comes to the sharpness. As you can see, the center still looks really fantastic, but contrast, if you're looking carefully, isn't quite as high. And you can see here that there's just more pop and just a little bit softening of the look of the textures at 40 millimeters versus 35 millimeters. We look over here, you can see how that all those individual dots are clearly defined. They're just a little less so if you look at the 40 millimeter edge of things, though at the same time 40 millimeters still looks pretty great. You stop down a bit at 40 millimeters here at f2.8 and we see we're right back to that just fantastic pop of contrast that we saw previously. Now at 45 millimeters, the end of the range, you can see there is a little bit of an improvement there in the center of the frame. In the mid frame, it is a very slight improvement, not as noticeable, but here in the corners, we can see that it is more noticeable there, that the corners definitely look better at 45 millimeters than what they do at 40 millimeters. Here in this mid frame zone, you can just see there's more contrast, more detail. Not quite as high as what we saw at 35 millimeters, but I think second only to that. So what I love at 45 millimeters is just a gorgeous blend of sharpness and then softness. And so we can see where the plane of focus is. It's beautifully sharp, but then it just falls off to a really creamy, really nice bokeh. Even here at f1.8, when it comes to shooting landscapes, you can see it's just brilliantly sharp there in the center of the frame. And really right off to the edge, it's a little bit softer, but it looks still really, really great. And as I mentioned earlier, I just feel like this lens has the special sauce where it's able to take ordinary photos like this. This is just of a tote bag in a restaurant. It was a gender reveal party, and this was the gift kind of basket my wife put together. So I was just taking it to document the moment. But then I looked at the photo, and it's like, man, that is a great looking picture. And that really is a tribute to this lens. Ordinary shots of just these family moments. You can see that the detail and the overall look of the images is just really great. Here's another one from my daughter's birthday, and just taking a picture of the homemade ice cream cake. You can just see how the image just shines, and that's what I think is really special from this lens. It's also obviously beautiful for any kind of landscape type work. You know, it's able to produce really fantastic detail, but then it's got great color and contrast, just really strong. Now up close at our minimum focus distance, you can see a decent amount of magnification, 0.25 times. That's a 1:4 magnification ratio. And so I think it's a little bit softer up close, but you can see it's the plane of focus isn't perfectly flat, but where you're really in focus, the detail looks really crisp. And so if you are, focusing in real world shots, I mean, it's not macro levels of contrast there, though it looks good. But if you look at the image as a whole, really, really nice. Likewise here, you can just see that the fall off is really beautiful from this lens. Here's another one here. I like shooting along chain link fences because it's a repeating pattern with hard edges that, kind of separates the men from the boys, so to speak. And in this case, you can see that while there's just a little bit of, you might call it jitteriness there, it is very, very mild. And actually this shot overall looks really nice. This one I think just looks beautiful. I mean, I really feel like this image is able to create a surprisingly creamy defocus area that is amazing for a zoom and actually great even for a 45mm f1.8 lens. Another shot here, this at 40 millimeters. So even if this is the place where the lens is the softest at 40 millimeters, you can see that that is relative. It looks amazingly sharp, and the bokeh is really beautiful. Colors are great. Even here with the bokeh, if we get a lot in the transition zone, as we do in this shot, because I'm a little further away from the subject, the background's not as, so the ratio from, the camera to the subject to the background is not great. But you can see it's really not bad at all, even with all of these specular repeating highlights. It looks just fine, and of course, great sharpness on our plane of focus there. Excellent all around. Finally, when it comes to flare resistance, here, bright sun in the frame coming through these leaves. You can see there's very little in terms of ghosting or flare artifacts. In this shot, where the sun is just right out of the frame, you can see that it's held up just fine. Contrast and detail all look excellent. This is a lens that really doesn't have much when it comes to optical flaws.
So hopefully this deeper dive into the optical performance has helped you to get a better sense of the overall feel and quality of this lens and can help you to make a more informed buying decision. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.